Labour leader Ed Miliband has made a major speech in the city today on the deficit and his plans for reducing it. Mr Miliband is hoping to tackle what's perceived by voters and opinion polls as a weakness in Labour's policies, namely the lack of a strategy for reducing the deficit. With me to discuss Mr Miliband's strategy is Sarah O'Connor from our economics team. Sarah, what was Mr Miliband telling us this morning about Labour's plans to cut the deficit?
He set out 5 sort of broad principles. Clearly, this is trying to compensate for the fact that he completely forgot to mention the deficit at all in his conference speech, which is very embarrassing. So this is his attempt to kind of tackle head-on what Labour's stance is on the deficit.
And do you think he was successful? I mean, is he going to convince people with what he was saying?
I mean, I've been talking to quite a lot of city economists this afternoon, and they're slightly nonplussed, really, because in terms of the detail, we didn't learn an awful lot that we didn't already know.
So what was new today?
What he said was they want to get a current budget surplus, so that's sort of day-to-day government spending, as soon as possible. They've said that before. They said that that will mean they'll need to cut departmental spending in non-protected areas every year. So they haven't said that before, but frankly, I think that's what we would have expected, right? If you need to get to a surplus, then unless you were going to do enormous tax rises, you would have thought that that was what they were going to have to do. So actually, on the details, I don't think we learned a huge amount.
And what do we now know about the main differences between the Conservatives and Labour on the deficit?
So the differences in their stated plans are quite large now. So the Conservatives are saying they want to reach an absolute surplus, and their plans, as currently penciled in, have a 23 billion surplus by the end of the next Parliament. Labour, meanwhile, is targeting this current surplus. So actually, when you sort of do the sums, and we've done that here internally, that means that the Conservatives have 23 billion to play with, and Labour has about 50 billion to play with. So that's the sort of scale of the differences.
And politically, what sort of messages was Mr Miliband trying to send? Do you think there were several references to the 1930s, weren't there, in his speech here? I think he mentioned 1930s 4 times. What's he trying to do there?
I think he's trying to play on this. The Office for Budget Responsibility mentioned that government spending under the current coalition plans is set to fall to the lowest share of GDP since 1938. I think Miliband is really just trying to play on this sort of idea that this would be absolutely dreadful.
Because there's a bit of a sense there, isn't it? I think Labour senses an opportunity, doesn't it, that the Conservatives may have overplayed their hands on spending cuts.
I think so. I think Labour senses that there's an opportunity to kind of skirt around and say, look, we also agree that it's important to sort out the deficit, but we're not going to do it in this sort of extreme, over-the-top way. I mean, I think Miliband basically said, the Tories are cutting because they want to, we'll only cut when we have to, and we'll try and do it in a fairer way. So that's the politics of it.
And how much do you think this will all matter with voters? I mean, how decisive is this issue for voters at the election, do you think?
Well, I mean, Labour's economic credibility is still one of their big problems, isn't it? But I mean, I suppose the question is, how much does this go to improving that, given that we didn't really learn any more details? And certainly what investors were saying to me today was, well, okay, fine, he wants to tackle the deficit, but where he hasn't even said what proportion of tax increases to spending cuts he wants to do, for example.
Absolutely. So we've had sort of the Conservatives clearly trying to paint Ed Miliband as an economic disaster, Mr Miliband coming back and saying the Conservatives are ideological, extreme and unfair, and of course in May the voters will decide which version they prefer. Sarah, thank you very much for joining me to discuss Mr Miliband's speech.